This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with musician Andy Edwards, who runs a popular YouTube site. The general topic will be the decline of rock music. The subject for today is the decline of rock music. I want to try to put it in context with the decline in the arts generally, whether it's literature or poetry or dance or film or television. But I'm speaking with Andy Edwards. He's a popular YouTuber, also was a member of a rock band, and we're going to talk a little bit about himself, his website, his background in music, and then get on to the topic. So, welcome, Andy. For those who don't know you or your website, if you could give a little background about who you are, your background in music, and how you decided to start your website.
So my name's Andy Edwards. I'm a drummer. I'm also a multi-instrumentalist, but professionally I've worked as a drummer. I'm a producer and an educator. I've taught music, and I've made my living doing all of those. Sometimes full-out pro musician, touring the world. When I played 20 odd years ago with Robert Plant, so I was his drummer for a number of years. I've played on the progressive rock scene, on the sort of technical drumming scene, but I've also worked as a music teacher, and for the last 16 years, up until this year, I was head of music in a local college. So I've thought long and hard about music education and how to educate young creative people. My degree originally was in fine art, so I started as a painter, so I've got a background in art and film as well, so that's very interesting that we can get to talk about the other art forms. I've been aware of the decline of what I will call performed music, starting when I was playing back with IQ and Frost, some progressive rock bands back in the late 2000s, around about 2008, 2009. I noticed that the funds we were getting from CD sales, the ability to tour, everything was getting more and more difficult. And I've tracked that for the last, say, 20 years to watch that decline happening. And I've noticed a number of things. So a few years ago, after having a video on YouTube suddenly get more views than I expected, it wasn't what I normally did. When I set up my YouTube 10 years ago, it was basically to just put videos of me drumming up, just what everyone else does. And then over COVID, I did a video on the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I ranked their albums, and I came back and I've realised that it had traction of its own accord. And when you're in the music business, you're trying so hard to get traction on stuff that you've worked on, and there's nothing there. So to get traction on something that I hadn't really worked at was interesting. So I started to research into YouTube, applying some of the stuff I'd learned from the music industry. And, 3 years later, I've now got 26,000 subscribers, and I do 500,000 views a month. And it's growing very fast. So I have now, at this stage in my career, 40 years in, I am now a YouTuber.
So I've noticed on YouTube that there tend to be several types of YouTube music sites. There's the sites where people react to something, and usually it's black American people reacting to white music, and oh, a white person can sing. The other one is the sort of educational site. There's a fellow named Rick Beato who does stuff. There's a fellow in England called David Bennett. And there's another fellow named Phil from Wings of Pegasus who's sort of like a one-man band. And they do reviews, and they listen to something and they say, a 1967 recording of Chuck Berry. Let's listen to the guitar and see what... you, however, seem to be more, from what the few dozen videos I've seen of you, you have the records all in the background, and you pull out your top 10 or 12, and you say, here's Robin Trower or something in this thing. Let's listen to this here, and why this. What genre of YouTube music video do you fall in? Do you look at yourself as an educator or just more popular consumption?
When I started off, what I was doing was ranking videos. And you have to understand how a ranking videos works. It's basically on nosiness, and it's also on the person wants to have validation for what they believe. So if you go, let's do the 10 greatest reggae albums, and then they go, well, I like reggae, and they're going there not to see my opinion on it. They're going to see my opinion, coincides with theirs. If it does, it makes them feel that they're very special because they've got someone in agreement with them. And if I don't agree, then they get all angry and they put lots of comments up, and it makes the algorithm work. So ranking videos are you know, they work in a certain psychological way. A lot of people say, why won't you put the top 10 up on, you know, in the description? And I'm like, of course I'm not going to do that, because I want them to watch the video to find out what I've got on number one. YouTube videos work on a formula, and what it is that the first thing is the title and the thumbnail. So you pull them in, and you pull them in with a promise. I'm going to do rank these top 10 videos. Then you have to tell them you're going to do that at the beginning. Then you do it, right? But as you're doing it, you introduce something that holds them there. That's really important, because YouTube's far more interested in people holding there. You can have 1 million views, but it might be people just clicking on it and going, this is awful, and clicking off. So you have to hold them there. So I have learned to start to bringing stuff that was counterintuitive to that top 10. And a lot of my fan base knows that if they stick around to the end, something strange might happen. And what I brought into it, I wasn't aware of this when I started, but as I carried on, there was two aspects. There was a much deeper philosophical discussion about what is good, because I imagine that's why people were coming to the thing fundamentally. They want to know what is good. Can we know what is good? You know, is it subjective or is it objective? Is, you know, what are musicians trying to achieve? How does it relate to mental health issues? All these things that I've always been interested in. I brought those things in. But also, I brought in a sense of humour, surreal sort of comedy, strangeness. And the way I see it is exactly what you said. The middle-aged white guy in front of his record collection is like a genre. And so, but I'm not like any of those, because I subvert it. I'll do things that you don't expect to happen all the time. And so now, that's a very long-winded and pretentious answer to the fact that I'm hoping that I'm creating my own genre of YouTube, you know, because I don't even have to talk about music now. I could talk about anything if I really wanted to.
Yeah, recently you did a video, I think it was called The 10 Most Influential or Important, and a lot of the comments were sort of niggling on what's the difference between importance, influence, and excellence. So, for example, like people, you know, and I would say that the four guys of Led Zeppelin are better musicians than the Beatles, the four guys, but were they more influential? I mean, the Beatles came first, the Beatles were more pop-oriented, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, you get this, well, this how could you keep Pink Floyd off the list? They were much better musicians than, well, you know, some other. It was a band from the '70s. I think there was
Kraftwerk. That
right,
really
Kraftwerk, right? The German band, yeah.
Yeah, which is possibly the most influential band in history. But my fans, who are into progressive rock, classic rock, jazz fusion, and jazz, and are a little bit muso orientated, they didn't get Kraftwerk. But the most important thing, and people don't understand this. As an educator, I've spent half my life going into a classroom and trying to get a conversation going. I don't care whether I'm right or wrong. I don't care if the students are right or wrong. What I want is to get them to think for themselves. Yeah. And so I've spent 30 years going in and saying something contentious to students, getting a conversation going, then questioning what their beliefs are, and they start to get a better idea of what art is, what music is, what they want to do, what the industry wants. And so I can't help but do that. And what I enjoy is the fact that there's a conversation going on. This is why I'm so involved in the comments, which I'm going to have to stop doing. I can start to do my head in. There's just too many. Yeah. But isn't it good that everyone's having a good conversation, not about, like, you know, Israel and Palestine or right versus left. They're just having a conversation about music, talking about aesthetics, what they like. It doesn't really matter. But I think people come because they want to have that discussion. Yeah. You know, so I may play act and really say something contentious. I might say something I really believe in. Sometimes I lie. Yeah. Sometimes I contradict myself because I don't see
like
YouTube.
Walt Whitman.
Yeah. This is it. I'm a musician and an artist first and foremost. I see the YouTube as all YouTube is art. What we're doing now is art. Yeah. It might have an educational aspect to it, but you know, we're not part of a curriculum, are we? We're trying to create something that will entertain to start off with, and hopefully there's some sort of uplifting or learning about the world, right? But it's got to be entertaining first. You know, there's information there, So that's the way I see it. I'm fascinated by aesthetics. I'm fascinated by creativity. I'm really interested in the fact that for most people, listening to music and having that aesthetics, thrill, is what life's about. It's once you've fed yourself and paid the mortgage and got your bills paid, we're here to have fun, aren't we? And so this is what makes our life important.
So let me
So,
let me talk about the idea of influence or importance and what you mean by that. And let me give you. I come from a literature poetry background, so let me talk about what I would consider the poetry equivalent to the Beatles when we talk about influence. Emily Dickinson here in the U.S. Has had a massive influence in getting women for 100+ years to write poetry. However, no one writes poetry like Emily Dickinson. She's sort of out on the end of a limb, that is, for better or worse, totally Dickinson. And I look at the Beatles as the same way. When people talk about the Beatles being influential, sure, there were 1,000 bands and 10,000 bands over 60 years that wanted to have the success of the Beatles. But how many of them became just a studio band that tinkered and did this and followed that same career arc as the Beatles? So when we talk about influence, did they get a lot of kids interested in rock music? If that's influence, yes. But if we're talking about setting a kind of path where musicians will go down, most of the kids who went into bands, in the wake of the Beatles, wanted to fill arena rock stadiums. So what does influence mean in music to you, at least?
right, if you take your example, the Beatles came out as a rock band. They come out as sort of a rock and roll band, really. Once they got into the studio, then they realised that the album was the key thing, not the live gigs. So they stopped gigging, and then they start to use the studio as an instrument. If you look at all commercial music, bar about 10%, that's how it's made now. Guys in studios that don't go out and tour. So in that aspect, this is the thing that's remarkable about the Beatles. That aspect you just named is hugely influential, and it's so influential that we cannot see how influential it is.
Yeah.
There's a million people, and this is what we're talking about, the decline of rock. When the Beatles went into the studio and stopped performing live, them as an entity that needed to be guitar, bass, drums, two vocalists, all that went out the window. They could do Eleanor Rigby, that was just a string quartet, and Paul McCartney, and it was still the Beatles.
Yeah.
If you then throw a computer in a mix, the computer can be the string section, and then suddenly you're into the realm that we're in now. So what the Beatles were pioneering there was the very thing that would end up being the death of performed music, which is what I call it.
Yeah. Now,
So the technology required in 1965 to make music was a rock and roll band at that time. That's what you needed. You don't need that anymore to make music.
so I want to try to pinpoint when rock sort of peaked and fell, but certainly in the last 10 years, people like the Rick Beatos online will be talking about two things, basically. There's lots of videos about sort of the automatic computer drumming, that you don't need a human being to drum.
Yeah.
And secondly, the adjustment of the voice, to get something pitch perfect. But these came much later. What is your take on both of those? The automated drumming and everyone can be a singer, even me, who can barely speak well.
What you have to step back, so Rick Beato will focus on that, but that's a detail. You have to step back and culturally see what's going on across all of the arts and see how something which had cultural value, which I would say in 1968, the things that was culturally valued was self-expression. So Jimi Hendrix is the guy you want because it's all self-expression, right? People don't want that now. The culture's shifted. How much self-expression do we really want? Mm-hmm. And you look in the culture, and you see there's an argument going on against the left and right. And that is an argument on one way of saying, this is one way of expressing myself, but we can't do this. And then the right is saying, no, they're libertarian, you should be able to have free speech, but you can't have that. So that's the same argument, because self-expression is under question. In the 1960s, it was like the most valuable thing that they had. So these cultural things shift. If we take rock and roll, believe me, when the electric guitar was invented, all the acoustic guitarists felt that the machine was coming in. When the electric bass, when there's no air, and everything's electric and it's just going to amplifiers, you're removed from the expressive process of perform music. Once you go through a big PA, that's removal again. When the Beatles start multi-tracking, that's a removal again. And then the machines come in, and then synthesizers come in. So now you haven't got oboes, you've got a replication of an oboe, or sounds you've never heard. So it's been a very slow process. You could almost see rock and roll as having its own demise built into its birth.
Yeah. You know,
because rock and roll was not a big band. You know, a jazz big band, which is a technology before, you know, Frank Sinatra wasn't in front of a rock and roll band, he was in front of a big band. And that requires a composer, an arranger, a ton of instruments playing, right, rehearsal spaces that are big. There's your music industry there. When rock and roll came out, that all went. And that generation felt like they'd lost something in the same way as our generation is now feeling that we're losing something as rock music dies. And rock music died a long time ago. Let
me just talk about the concept of self-expression. A lot of people take the word self-expression to what used to be called, for example, confessional poetry, let's say the Sylvia Plath kind of thing. But anything that you do is going to necessarily be an expression of where you are in that moment. If you're just, you know, screwing around on your guitar and you're playing some jazz riff, and then you segue into, you know, some riff from the 80s, Dokken or something, you know, that's going to express what you're doing. So it seems to me that in art generally, the idea of self-expression is the self comes first rather than the expression. You know, the expression is going to naturally be there. But if you're on your drums and you're doing, you know, some Buddy Rich, and then you segue over into When the Levee Breaks or something, you know, that's going to express who you are. So it seems to me that's a bit broader sense and a bit more less navel-gazing sense of self-expression. Do you agree?
No, I would disagree with that as well, because I think what was happening is very difficult to not talk within the cultural epoch in which we've grown up. Like I said, the 1960s self-expression became very, very important. But if you talk to an Indian classical musician, they don't believe they're self-expressing them. They're not expressing themselves at all. They are revealing the nature of God in the universe, right? And so when you look at art, it swings between perfectionism and self-expression. And art culturally balances those two things. Anybody who's written poetry will know you're trying to express yourself, but you're also trying to make it work structurally. And there's a thing that's containing the self-expression. And an artist knows that they're trying to get the balance between those two things correct. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about self-expression, but culturally, when we need more self-expression, the dial swings over to that. Mm-hmm. Now, what you hear with dance music and electronic music is there's no expression there, but people still like it because it's much more about order. It's much more about the grid. It's much more about perfectionism. In the same way that somebody who was trying to design a cathedral, you know, in the sort of Renaissance period, was not trying to express themselves. They were trying to do something else, and it was much more lined in with perfection. So I have always said my fundamental definition of art is the balance between perfection and hedonism. And hedonism, I think, is a better word than self-expression. But we living in an age at the moment where in this epoch, we value self-expression, but we're noticing that the new art forms that are coming in are moving away from self-expression as a reaction against the sort of postmodernist idea of the self, you know, and the authorship of the self, which became very important in the 1960s.
I recently saw an online video about the life of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he's usually held up as the epitome of what you said, the glorification of God and his music and whatnot. But isn't there also has to be an essential part of Bach that the person who strives to be that expresser of the divine. I mean, that contains a little bit of the self. I mean, I
said, this is the whole point. This is what we're finding really difficult as a culture to understand, because we are now, it's got to be one thing or another. Yeah. So it has to be one or another. It's not. It's always a balance between the two. But we can see that something like, say, Bach, is probably a more sublime balance of perfectionism and hedonism than say Jimi Hendrix was. Jimi Hendrix is more on the expressive side, and Kraftwerk, to mention another band that came out a few years later, is much more on the sort of perfectionist side. And that Dial 6, Bach's in there, but it's not expressive like, say, the blues. A blues singer would be expressive. It's a different thing, but that it's always a balance between those two, and that's what's important.
So let's talk about the decline of rock music. In my email to you, on one of the emails I sent to you, I put for me the date when most art, especially big commercial art, started the downward trend around 1980. And I'm talking about film, the end of New Hollywood. I'm talking about literature. I'm talking about, I'd say 1965 to the late 70s was the height of rock music. Generally speaking, whether we're talking soft rock or hard rock or heavy metal and whatever offshoots came off of then. I think there was a cultural turn. We can talk about the Thatcher Reagan influence. Where do you put sort of the turning point or the peak of rock, and why are we heading down if we are?
I think you've identified it, but what you have actually identified is the peak of rock. 1980 is the peak of rock. Mm-hmm. That's the summit. Rock music is climbing up a summit. It reaches the peak at 1980, and what you've identified is from 1980 it slowly starts to run downhill. So it's an arc. Yeah. And the way to see that, and you may knowing more about poetry than me, a lot more obviously, you might be able to help me out here, because I look at the period before. If we look at the modernist cultural epoch, modernism sort of starts around about 1912.
Yeah.
And it runs up to 1962. And what I mean by that is if you got someone in the 1930s and you talk to them, and then you get someone in the 1950s, they seem to have a certain set of values. And we find those values quite alienating now. So when we watch, say a housewife in the kitchen in the 1950s talking about her life, we go, oh, this is all really weird. As soon as you move into the 1960s, those hippies and the people like that, they seem much closer to us. And so I feel that the modernist era, which is all about technology and it's all about fitting into technology, and I always look at cultural epochs about looking at how they see the future. So from after the First World War, going into the 1920s, the Jazz Age, there's a difference. And the 1920s is that shift. It's like the 1960s. And in the 1920s, it shifts to what I call a modernist period. And it's all about, planes doing loop-the-loops, jazz, girls with short skirts and bobs on the back of an aeroplane kicking their legs. It's completely different to the sort of Edwardian Victorian period that went before. And that runs through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. And the great art form of that period is cinema. And cinema is made using the same sort of Henry Ford modernist production line, cog in the machine, aspect. That's the aesthetic. And when you look at that period's view of the future, it's all silver suits and a sort of a utopian, regimented situation. That's how we see it.
A madman approach to things.
Yeah, and when you get to the 50s, at the end of the 50s, you see this idea starting to break down. You see it within the arts. So I'll give you the example in literature that I would say is very important. 1962, where I think is the beginning of the rock and roll era, right? And this is where film becomes less important and rock and roll becomes the dominant art form. Here in the UK, 1962, we had a trial where we decided not to censor any more Lady Chatterley's Lover. That's the watershed period. Up until then, everything's controlled and within reason, when you've got censorship, and it's all within this tight ship of modernism. And then suddenly you see that in the literature and films that you suddenly the censorship comes off. And that's the self-expression emerging. And self-expression emerges in the arts. And I think it was very important to happen because there were many people around the world in the sort of Western sphere that didn't have a voice. Black people, gay people, women, all these people didn't have a voice. And I think that the culture realised to move forward, we had to let those voices in. And so suddenly, by opening the door to these new voices, you suddenly see new cinema, you see new ways of writing. So it's very interesting in the 1960s, someone like William Burroughs is cutting up words, he's experimenting with an idea of authorship, which is completely new, that almost takes self-expression out of the thing, and that's the sort of postmodernist sort of dichotomy that exists. And we now have exited that postmodernist period. I think 10 years ago, we are in the chaos of the 1920s or the 1960s. That's where we're in now. We've been in it for about 10 years.
Okay, let me.
That's what I think happened. So I would say rock and roll emerged in 1962. I would say it reaches a peak around about 1980, when Michael Jackson has got the biggest selling album in the world, and that is the peak of rock and roll. And at that point, it starts to bloat, and you see things like Live Aid. That's the bloating of rock and roll. And while that's happening, this sort of machine-based music, which is much less based upon the artist as the author of their sort of vision of the world, this auteur idea, that starts to die away. And that's been dying away, as you said, since 1980.
Okay.
And now we live in a sort of postmodernist world where the artist isn't even the artist. It's just a front. It's just an image. Like Andy Warhol predicted, it's just an image that sits there in front of us. Taylor Swift is just an image.
Andy, I want to pick up on what you were talking about regarding the peak, and I mentioned 1980. I think one of the things post-war in literature, the death knell for literature was set when writing became corporatized, and not only corporatized, but corporatized within academia. When you started getting Masters of Fine Arts writing programs that trying to tell people how to write, and you end up with people who don't know how to write, teaching people who have maybe some talent and telling them that their writing is bad when it isn't. That has led to a lot of this.
And when you say, I have no idea about this because I don't know about it, would you say that started to happen in the 1980s?
No. The first the North Carolina University had a writing program, Black Mountain writers. That started, the MFA programs took off started in the 40s. In the 1950s, they took off. By the 60s, it was entrenched. And this it takes a generation, 15, 20 years for things to see how they play out.
You're talking about, so I see what you're talking about now,
with literature.
I would see that as being the atrophying of modernism.
Yeah.
So modernism is all about Henry Ford. It's all about mass production. It's all about being a cog in the machine, and everything gets slowly. It's very exciting. The fact that people were probably exploring ways of writing, and there was a democratization of that through the 1920s and 1930s, and then it starts to become a rigid thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you had people like Norman Mailer or Gore Vidal, who were public intellectuals, who were writers, who were people who started off either in journalism or in the real world. They weren't in a soundproof room, metaphorically speaking, learning how to write. What is there an equivalent to the MFA writing programs in the music world, because you didn't really see the published writing really take a hit until about 1980, and as I said, it took 15 years or so for the MFA programs to get entrenched, and another generation before the results of that, were revealed.
Well, the thing is that it's slightly different in that with writing, the printing press had been invented centuries before, but music is completely changed by the invention of recording. And the invention of recording allows you now to create art forms out of improvised folk music forms. So you see this chaotic explosion based around blues and jazz in the 1920s. Okay, and these geniuses are emerging, and they're doing things that no one's ever heard before, and that slowly gets hemmed in. By the 1930s, you've got the big bands, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and then the sort of establishment come in. Artie Shaw, the bands, Artie Shaw, Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, they kick in. And by the 1950s, music has become this very prescribed, this is how the way you play. So you've got to go to music college, you're going to learn this. A sort of classical model of music training, how you play, has been established. So when Frank Sinatra gets up in 1956, All those musicians are highly skilled. They've got charts in front of them, and they're operating like a Henry Ford production line of music. Exactly the same things happen. And then suddenly, what happens in 1962? Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Exactly like I would say in literature, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac. Now, were they following that program? Was Jack Kerouac following that program of how to write?
No, but I'm not. I don't think the Beatniks, generally speaking, were an exemplar of great writing. I mean, Ginsberg had some great poetry. There are a few other names I could name, but to me, they're not much different than someone like a John Cage. And speaking of, I wanted to, because you mentioned it, classical music seems to have taken a hit almost as bad as rock and roll in terms of creativity. Because when you listen to a lot of the experimental stuff of the late 20th century, it's sort of like listening to speed metal. It sort of blends into one sort of, like my wife listens to early Metallica, and you listen to things like Celtic Frost or something, and it's just boom 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 boom, like a giant banging on a door.
Exactly the same thing happens within classical music, because classical music comes out of this sort of romantic, impressionist music. That's the late Victorian Edwardian period, and like I say, 1912. Suddenly, we've got Stravinsky's Rites of Spring. We've got Schoenberg's Serialism, and Serialism moves into 12-tone, and it becomes all very intellectual. And you start looking at atonalism, and this relates to the drive to abstract expressionism in painting. But in 1962, classical music shifts, and the minimalists come out. Steve Reich, Philip Glass, John Adams, Terry Riley, and these guys sell, in some cases, millions of records. It never gets mentioned. There is a turn. There's a turn in classical music, and that is being informed by jazz, and it's being informed by rhythm and blues, and in turn, it informs that music back. Mm-hmm. That these composers, Terry Riley sold almost on a rock level. Philip Glass was selling albums. They were like rock bands. Mm. And at that point, the sort of modern classical, all those people, they'd gone. They were Edgar Varese and people like that had gone. But people like Stockhausen that were also all this electronic music that we see ruining rock music, that starts off in classical music. It's people like Stockhausen, Pierre Boulez, in the 1940s or 1950s that were pioneering those ideas that then start to crop up in like Pink Floyd and Frank Zappa.
But is it essentially a problem with sort of the computerization of music, or simply that the people who are behind the computers are lazy? If you can just get a dum 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 drum beat, is it the laziness of the people using that technology? Well, it's not the technology itself.
I think you're measuring it on a metric which is basically based upon sort of 1960s, 1970s aesthetic of self-expression and perfectionism and a certain blend. Because what's really interesting is that as a painter, when I was at art college, William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac was such a huge influence on us as painters. Geniuses. That spoke to us far more than, and you say that they weren't very good, but the thing is that sort of classical thing you're discussing, that's not where it was at. And the machine music that's coming out at the moment is doing something different. The rock music is dying, but what it's being replaced with is not worse. It's not a decline in the arts. It's a shift in the arts, because the arts always feeds the era that we live in. Yeah, and for our age group, we're not going to be. We're approaching death. So we understand this, and we look at it. We don't get it because we have become the Dumbledores of our era. We're wise and we know stuff. But there's Harry Potter's coming in, and we have to let the Harry Potters. They don't understand it. So the kids, I've taught kids. They get a computer, they get a sample, and they start making music, and they are expressing something. Well, and they do guitar solos and sing? No, because that's not what it's about.
There's always a lag between the best art and its recognition. For example, we mentioned Bach. For 150 years after his death, Bach was pretty much forgotten. And then the mid-1800s, was it Liszt or Beethoven who resurrected him? I forget who. Yeah. But I'll guarantee you the best music from the 2020s that we think is not going to be what's considered the best music in 2100. They're going to look back and say, oh, those fucking idiots. Why didn't they know the genius of fill in the blank?
Yeah. But also, that's because certain music has the function of fixing problems in the now, culturally. And this is popular music. That only lasts for... There's an art form that only does its job for a month. That's what it's there to do. And then other art forms, when you go to a culture in the future, what's interesting, and I think this is the thing where my sort of era, this is my snobbery kicks in. I value above all other things is visionary artists that seem to understand where the next thing was and did things artistically that weren't understood at the time. You see, so Bach's very important in the history of music because up until Bach, because he's on the cusp of the classical era, and classical era is about structure. Before then, it's about harmony. Yeah. So if you go to earlier, pre-classical music, the harmony is actually a lot more complex. Beethoven's harmony is a lot more simpler, but Beethoven is interested in the structure, the symphony, and saying something within that. And so Bach, I think it's the structural elements that were interesting going forward. Perhaps I don't know enough about classical music to really go any further than that. But I think, certain artists predict the future. They're like massively important.
Well, yeah, and a visionary artist not only does that, but they bend the world to their own needs. For example, if I speak to you of a Whitmanian viewpoint on life, you have an idea. If I talk about a Kubrickian viewpoint on life, you have a certain view of the cosmos as filtered through their eyes or their art.
Yeah.
Let me just talk about a couple of things before we talk about how we can sort of right the ship. One of the big cultural franchises, and I hate that term in art, but the cultural franchises is Star Trek here from America. And one of the things that I've said is Star Trek to me is a perfect example of a dystopia, because it's people who think they're in a utopia who don't realize they're in a dystopia. And I say this because when you look at these episodes, they seem to have no real culture. Whenever they talk about music, they're playing 1920s jazz or something, as if in 400 years there hasn't been gobs of innovations. So, and I know it's because you can't really, for an episode of TV, write a symphony that's going to sound new. But do you think that culturally speaking, whether we're talking about a decline in film, music, literature, whatever it is, how do you think that affects culture in terms of, I guess, not just aesthetically, but the value of culture itself? Do you think that it's denigrated by the lack of vibrant art?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. This is because this is why we have art, and this is why it's hard to discuss it. Because in some cases, art is going to come along and show you the way into the new culture. And when that comes along, the establishment, which will be all the old people, they will not recognise it. Right? When the Beatles came, all these bands that everyone's championing, Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix, to the generation of musicians before, they look like numbskulls.
Yeah.
You can see that because these guys were highly trained. They could really play. And rock music isn't about that type of skill.
Yeah.
At all. It's like the greatest rock musicians aren't that great. The Led Zeppelin are not that great musicians. In reality, culturally we believe they're great, but in reality they're not that great. And any session musician, any professional session musician, drummer would be a greater drummer than John Bonham. Because John Bonham's genius was not about being technically the greatest drummer in the world. It was about his creativity and coming up with the parts for those records, which are unique. Mm-hmm. It was about self-expression, because that's what that era was about. So John Bonham sounds like nobody else. He's got a feel like nobody else. He's an absolute genius. But I've got way more technique than John Bonham. I know about technique, but I'm not as great. I can say this because I learnt this playing for Robert Plant. I can remember sat in a rehearsal with Robert Plant thinking, I don't get this. I've got all these chops. Why can't I deliver what Robert wants? And I realised it's because the genius that John Bonham had was something completely different. And that's the era of rock and roll. The guys that sat in the back of Count Basie's band were much greater technicians than the rock guys were.
That reminds me of, I've argued with people too, that you don't have to necessarily know all the stuff that you would learn in, say, a film school or in a music academy or whatnot. And I use the Beatles as a good example of synergy, because if you look at the four of them and their solo careers, let's say they started out as solo artists first before they formed the supergroup, the Beatles. I don't think you could go from point A to point B and say, listening to Ringo and John's and Paul's and George's stuff, that they would be that good together. And to me, they're a perfect example of where something is greater than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, and that is the rock band.
Yeah.
You know, whereas like a big band or an orchestra doesn't work like that.
No, but how is that different? How is that different with Count Basie versus the Beatles?
Because those musicians have to interpret what Count Basie wants, what the arranger wants. They stick a score in, they've got to be able to read that score, improvise within that score. They've got to be able to play much broader harmonic structures, much broader rhythmical structures. They've got to express themselves in a way that is absolutely... I mean, the Count Basie and Duke, these are geniuses, absolute geniuses. You know, in terms of, competency, way more competency than most rock bands, just way more. And the thing is, this is how much our culture's atrophied, is because we look back at the Beatles, right? Who was the most technically advanced player? If we just talk about technique and skill, which one's the most technically advanced in the Beatles, would you say?
Oh, God, I would say Harrison, probably. Or maybe Ringo.
I would say Ringo Starr.
Okay, yeah. I remember, because I said Harrison, but then I remember I saw a video too, where they side by side compared Harrison with Best doing the same songs.
You mean Ringo Starr and
oh yeah, Best. Ringo and Pete Best. Yes, I'm sorry.
If you examine the evidence of the Beatles are a great band. They'd gone to Hamburg, played every single day. They'd become tight. And they had this English take on, American rhythm and blues, which was really interesting. And they get signed. And when they get into the studio, they can cut it. But George Martin, who was a monster musician and can play and compose and read and do it, he was a monster musician. He looks at it and goes, this drummer's no good. So at that point, they have to go and get a good drummer. Now, the Beatles just happened to be guys that had come together. They weren't necessarily that competent, but they gelled as a unit.
Yeah.
Ringo was there. They went back to Liverpool. Went, well, who's the best guy in Liverpool? It was Ringo, so they brought Ringo in. And Ringo sits at the back and he nails it. He nails the drumming. And George Martin, right, because every other band at that point was bringing in session guys to play on their records. And a lot of the Beatles records have got session guys on it. This is the big secret nobody wants to talk about. There's loads of Beatle records where they're not playing on those records because that's what was going on in the 1960s, because that's how music was made. There was a bunch of session musicians that were brought in. The Wrecking Crew were basically jazz musicians. They were sort of musicians that existed in like Count Basie's band or, Stan Kenton's band, and then they were working in the 1960s. And the reason they called themselves the Wrecking Crew is because those musicians believed they were wrecking music. The thing we're talking about, the decline, the Wrecking Crew believed they were wrecking the art back then by doing those sessions. Right?
Yeah.
So what we see is it's not got better, it's not got worse, it's just shifted. So I'm pretty sure a lot of the things that's going on now in the arts is not the decline of the arts, it's a shift of the arts. But the trouble is, I think the scary bit is there's actually a decline of Western civilization going on at the moment. And that is being expressed within the arts very well and competently.
Let me ask, though, because I think it's an interesting link up. You talked about the genius of Bonham as a drummer, and you talked about, I guess we'd call it the hyper competence of Ringo as a drummer. So when you look at
Ringo's the one. Ringo's the one that comes in. He's a highly skilled drummer, and he's the one that comes in and puts a stamp on drumming that changes the nature of drumming. He's not a technical player like Buddy Rich, or Louis Bellson, or Max Roach, or any of the drummers that came from the period before. He had nowhere near that technique, but he had more chops and technique than John, Paul, or Ringo. He had more than them, but they had very little.
Yeah,
very little.
But specific to Bonham, is the difference between the two of them because Ringo could play just about anything well, whereas Bonham was
And what
just
Bonham had
scraping his
way more
soul.
tops than Ringo. It's not about the technical. It's rock and roll is not about the technical excellence. Bonham did have more chops than Ringo, without a doubt. But Bonham did not have the sort of chops of a guy that walks into a session in the 1980s and plays on a Michael Jackson album.
Yeah.
Because that guy is the old school. That's Quincy
Right.
Jones, who was the jazz arranger, and those guys can read and interpret. If
But
you
it's
imagine
it's the nature of their job to be guns for hire, so to speak.
guns for hire, and that it requires more skill.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to make the point is that what makes rock and roll great isn't the skill.
Mhm.
It's something else. It's the expression of the self. It's the individuality. It's the visceralness of rock and roll, which is a countercultural, mixed with a certain perfection that technology brought in. And so the argument that this is some sort of golden period, it's not. It's all a golden period.
So
You know.
I want.
So
Oh, go ahead.
it's like what the great hip hop artists, rappers were doing in the 1980s was as high art as the Beatles. What the early dance music people who were programming dance music in 90s, that stuff was creatively as great as the Beatles. It was all as great. And music was all great, but what's happened is we're in a decline now of actual Western civilization, I believe, which is why the music has become atrophied, really atrophied. So I agree with you with that. All the arts have.
So let me just ask, because you mentioned a few times dance music. What is your take on disco? Was disco a premonitor of premonition of what was to come, or do you think that there was good disco too?
Oh God, the best disco is as great. I mean, if you take a band like Earth, Wind and Fire,
Oh yeah,
technically, in terms of skill, they destroy Led Zeppelin. Absolutely destroy them. They've got way more technique and skill than. But that's the reason is because they're doing disco, and disco's harder to play. Obviously, it is. I know culturally, everyone's going to go, "Well, no, I thought Led Zeppelin." That's a culture. That's the cultural con that we live in. Zeppelin aren't about that. They're playing rock pentatonics, blues scale, riffs. Earth, Wind and Fire got brass section arrangement. They've got all these things interlocked together, really complex harmony, really complex chords. There's vocal harmonies going on. Phil Bailey's got a range of vocals that's way past Robert Plant's.
when you say the con that's going on, that implies that there's an agency, there's some people behind running some kind of a scam. Is this the people who run the record companies that are doing that?
It's the mystique that was put around. I mean, these musicians like Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, they're genius musicians. But the thing is, they were marketed like that because it was all about their authorship. It was they were like these geniuses that were expressing themselves. Whereas somebody like take someone like Michael Jackson, he's as musically talented as anybody in Led Zeppelin, if not more so. Right, and then Quincy Jones and the players he's got in that. I mean, God, the players on Thriller are ridiculous. The power and musical skill that's brought to bear on that album is astonishing on Thriller, right? And so but it's a different type of thing. So what we're seeing is it's all about the perspective is moving, the needle's running from hedonism to perfectionism. You see, there's a drawing in. After the Beatles, we see this sort of it becomes all self-expressive. You get Pink Floyd, Yes, Genesis. You've got Parliament Funkadelic. All these bands that are coming out in the early 70s. It's all opulent, right? But that can only last a certain amount of time, and then it starts to get drawn in. In the UK, our sort of progressive rock scene that we pioneer gets drawn into punk. And in America, that sort of rhythm and blues, soul, jazz fusion, jazz rock, Miles Davis thing, that gets pulled back into disco. And the disco is just, I mean, if you listen to Chic, or you listen to a Heatwave, or you listen to any of those groups, it's unbelievable what they're musically doing.
I want to talk about riding the ship, but you mentioned punk. One of the things I found interesting, and I would ask you if you agree. I think punk was far more influential in England than it was in the U.S. I mean, if you compare, what's the name, the Ramones versus, what was it?
Sex Pistols
Sex
or the
Pistols.
Clash.
Yeah. If you compare those two, it seems to me that the British punk scene was far more vibrant than America. Am I off on that, or?
But yeah, the British, see, the thing is that the relationship between British rock music and American rock music is a strange one, right? So if I was to start to say who's the biggest artist in the world, we're probably going to go on Michael Jackson, Prince, I don't know, Tina Turner. All the individual artists, the great ones, are American. But once you say bands, who's the biggest band in the world? I don't know, maybe the Beatles. Then who next? I don't know, Rolling Stones. Who next? I don't know, Led Zeppelin maybe. And it takes a long time before we get to say Metallica, Aerosmith. All these are rubbish compared to our British bands.
Well, right? With the exception, I would say, of the Doors. The Doors were probably in that top
the Doors sounded like a hippified version of bossa nova music. The Americans at that point hadn't got a clue what rock was. You know, Arthur Lee, Love, they're great bands. Jefferson Airplane, they're all great bands. I love them. I love them.
What was your take on the Beach Boys? What was your take on the Beach Boys?
The Beach Boys. The Beach Boys didn't invent surf rock. That was Dick Dale. They were like a barbershop quartet singing songs about, you know, and then for 5 minutes, Brian Wilson, you know, made a record that influenced the Beatles. If it hadn't influenced the Beatles, no one would be talking about them anymore. Yeah. But the reason why the Beach Boys gets pushed is because America does not have a comparable band to Cream, or the Rolling Stones, or the Who, or the Yardbirds, or Led Zeppelin, you know, or Black Sabbath, or Deep Purple. You haven't got those comparable bands. And so you see that run up towards punk. And punk solves a problem. Now this then runs up, if you follow that up, in 1991, Nirvana brought an album out that was full-on punk, straight from the Sex Pistols, straight from the Clash, straight from the Ramones, straight from the Stooges, all that stuff. They brought an album that sold 35 million copies and not only changed rock music, but also changed culture for the last 30 years. That's the influence of British punk. It's Nirvana.
So let's talk about riding the ship. I mentioned earlier that 1980, and you agreed, was sort of the peak, and then there's a slow...
A rock and roll, yeah, for that period, yeah.
But I'm a believer, not that I'm spiritually anything like India, but I'm a believer that culture goes in cycles. That
I mean, totally,
and number one, do you expect there to be another uptick in rock music, or is
no, never? It's gone. It is like romantic poetry. It is like Byron and Keats. It's gone.
And what do you think? I mean, you're not a big fan of Taylor Swift and that kind of thing. What do you think is the next big thing? Because rap music is sort of where rock was 20, 25 years ago. So there has to be something else that's going to come along that we can't see.
Music's going.
You don't think you think music itself, recorded music, is
because what happens is that it's all to do with culture. So, like I said, the modernist era, music wasn't the most important, predominant art form. It was cinema. Gone with the Wind, you know, Maltese folk and Lawrence. That's the main, and everybody's involved in that. You know, they're all going to the cinema on the night. It's you know, people got posters of film stars, and Elvis Presley is the thing that exists between the film star and the pop star. So Elvis Presley is really weird because he's more like a film star than he is a pop star, you see. It's quite strange. And then you have the era of rock and roll. And at that point, records and albums and rock music and rock concerts is the most important art form. Right? But it will not be the most important. Music won't go away, but it will retreat back to being a minor art form. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting with the rise of the internet is suddenly poetry that was almost like a dead art form when I was a kid. You know, who was interested in poetry? You know, we were listening to rock bands. You know, going to see Star Wars. You know, none of my mates read poetry, but because of Twitter and because of the internet, you know, the wordsmith skills have become really, really important, and words are actually have more traction along with visual imagery on the internet than music does, because this is the big problem. Music does not work on the internet.
Yeah, I don't want to digress because we're near the end, but I would totally disagree regarding writing. I think writing is far more done for as a major art form than music. But
You
regardless
really
of,
think so?
I can read, and when I look at online it gets back to the MFA. Everything is degraded to the level of the personal. You know, I have a wart on my clitoris. Let me write 3 lines that are prose broken into lines. That saying that, oh, having a clitoral wart is bad. I mean, that's the level. You're
You know
not.
what I think you're doing? I think the reason why you know, it's like if you take America, if you take the US, in the 1920s, the musical establishment in America realized that they needed to have a great American composer. So they actually set up a thing to go looking for the great American, but they're looking for the great American
It
composer.
was
They
American
don't
Idol in the
realize,
20s.
yeah, yeah. In the 1920s, they're looking for it, and they've got all these programs to try and find this great American composer that can compete with a Bach or compete with, you know, a Beethoven or Mozart. Um, and they don't realise that that person sat there. It's the most important musician of the 20th century. It's Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is the great. That's the great American composer. That's the greatest musician of the 20th century, without a doubt. But the establishment don't realise it. They just pass them by. And I think that the thing is that because I work in the internet, the language skills, written skills are so important. It's so important as to what I do, you know, because what I do is I have a YouTube where I go and talk. So I have to say stuff, and I've got better at saying stuff. But I also write so much stuff. I have blogs and I have stuff. My patrons, I write, you know, on ideas. Now, that idea of the novel, yeah, I don't think that's going to last much longer. Maybe, you know, that all that idea of writing is probably. I don't know. I mean, I think it's. I know people. I've got friends actually who are writing novels now, and they've been able to utilise the internet. But what you're getting is these new people that it's the Harry Potters are coming in, and us old people will not understand what they're doing. If we measure it by our metric, we will not understand what they're doing.
Well, let me give, because I wanted to mention this earlier. When we talked about classical composers, it seems that classical composers, you mentioned Philip Glass, most of them get sort of sucked into writing film scores, and they're more known in the last 30 or 40 years. Do you think that classical music, along with pop music, let's say, that's also done for
When
culturally?
I see, I get into trouble here. What I believe is that art forms have a relevance, and at that point they're alive, and you can tell when an art form is alive because it progresses, right? But it gets to a point where it can no longer progress. That and at that point, the powers that be come along and they close it off. They all tie it up and they stick it on the museum in the museum. Now you could still do that music. You could still play Bach. You can be in a Bach string quartet and you can play that music, but when you do it, you have to treat it like a museum piece. Right? So art forms are alive. Now, this is the big thing. If you look at rock music progressed up until 1995, and then in 1995 it completely stopped because it was dead. Now, there's still rock bands, and Foo Fighters and there'll still be people to want to listen to rock, and there will still be rock bands for the rest of time, but the form will no longer advance.
So what do you
It,
think will trump music or trump literature? I mean, are we talking gaming or something that we
Yeah,
don't know?
it's the internet. It's like I see my YouTube. I've said this over again. I'm a creative guy. I did my degree in fine art. I was a painter. Then I was a musician. I made records. I've done all that. I see my creative outlet as being my YouTube videos now.
Uh-huh.
YouTube videos is an art form.
Yeah. Well, but we're talking. It's sort of a subset of what used to be. I mean, the best videos are sort of like mini documentaries. So that's in a way sort of filmic, isn't it?
No, the
No.
YouTube video it doesn't work like film. It's completely different. And when you do a YouTube and you understand how it works, no, it's a completely different thing.
Hmm.
Absolutely, because the thing is that if you go to a YouTuber, a documentary exists on its own. You watch that documentary. YouTubers aren't like that. They're having to churn out stuff every single week, and so what it is, you're going into their world. and things aren't resolved. Videos come and then they go, then you dip into another video, you only watch half of it, then you move across. You know, nobody would, if somebody had only watched 10% of a film, they'd probably say, well, I didn't really see it. But you could go to YouTube, I mean, my YouTube, I've got 650 videos. No one's seen them all. No one will ever be able to get a handle on what I'm doing. Right? No one will. I can't even remember what I've done. It's weird, you know, it's like I go to do a video, and as I'm starting to work it out, I think a couple of times I've done the same video and didn't realise I'd done it before. I'd already talked about it. Yeah. Because even I can't track what I've done. That's way different to any other sort of film or media thing that's ever existed before. That's the first thing. It's not resolved, right? It's totally under my control. It's democratic to the, you know, I can do whatever I want to do. So I don't see it as being the same as a filmmaker at all. You know, I did my dissertation in French New Wave film, so I've got a bit of an idea of how film works. It is film, it is video, and it is film, but it's something else altogether.
So let me just then ask, where do you see the future of your channel? And is this going to be your primary art form, supplanting music then?
Yeah, and it's the way I earn my living now. So I haven't got a choice, because everything's collapsed in the music industry. So you can't work in it anymore, and the arts education is collapsing. Because I've been an arts music teacher, arts teacher for 30 years. I can't work in it anymore because it's collapsing. Arts education is collapsing for a whole bunch of reasons. One, because it's all about money. Two, because it's been ideologically captured, like you said, which is totally true. You know, so nobody's going to actually think for themselves. They're going to trot out the dogma ideology of the age, which is there to control us, right? There's too much focus on examinations rather than actual education. You know, it's like if you're here in the UK, if you're doing an English GCSE and you've got to interpret Shakespeare, you've got to write down what they want. You've got to interpret it, but you've got to say what they want. You can't say, well, my interpretation is this. That would be wrong.
So let me just ask you, if we view the videos as art form, you've mentioned that you're a middle-aged white guy with the records behind that's a genre. Do you see yourself breaking out of that genre a year or two from now, and maybe?
I already have. If you go and watch my channel, it's that some percentage of it is that. But see, the thing is, because I got my fine art background, and the thing is, as much as I criticise postmodernism, I understand a certain aspect of postmodernism that is very interesting, and it's that thing almost like Adorno of actually stepping back, or Brecht of stepping back and seeing, well, this is the thing that you're in, but I can mess that up, and I've done it repeatedly on my channel. There's so many weird things that I've done where I've messed up the narrative. So if you watch someone like Rick Beato, or you watch these people, they don't do what I do.
Well, yeah, you have a sort of that Twilight Zone twist sometimes at the end of a video.
Yeah, so, or even the beginning. I mean, it's like, say if I did the video where I just ate a piece of toast for the whole video. As a video I ate a piece of toast, and it was just as successful as the other videos, and my audience loved it. I didn't speak. And then at the end of that video, I just looked inside my cup that I just drunk my tea out of, and then I saw a new world open up, and I held the cup up, and as it zoomed in, it went into this incredible cave of wonder where I had dancing monkeys in space. And the reason I'm doing it is because at that point I am pushing the envelope of a YouTube video. You don't expect that in the terms of an old bloke in front of a records going through his favourite Black Sabbath albums.
Yeah. Now, let me just ask you, though, you said that the YouTube is your primary source of income. They are famously wanton in how they treat their quote-unquote creators. Do you ever worry that you're going to get like a strike or 3 strikes, or you're going to do something and they're going to ban you?
Oh my God, yeah, and then you suddenly realise this is the world we're living in. The totalitarian world we're living in, with the sham of self-expression. Mm-hmm. We have taken this idea of self-expression, of being able to be your own thing, have your own identity. We have taken that was so incredible in the 1960s and 1970s, and we have nailed it down. So you can express yourself however you want, as long as this is the way you express yourself. You know, it's this thing like, you know, what's the mantra of our age? Diversity. But it's not diversity of thought.
Yeah.
You say the wrong thing and you will be shut down. And I sit here as an old, I mean, I'm the old guy turning around saying, well, people should be able to say whatever they want. What, deny the Holocaust? Yeah, if they want. What, you all right with people denying the Holocaust? Yeah, if they want. They should be able to say it, because how can we prove them wrong if they don't say it?
Yeah.
You've got to let people express themselves so you can prove them wrong. You can't just, you know, I was chatting to a guy I know this morning, and he grew up in Yugoslavia, communist Yugoslavia, and we were talking about certain things that are going on in terms of censorship online. And this is a censorship that this is coming from people. Lecturers who've said something that their students don't like, and so their students shut them down.
Yeah.
Because it transgressed, whether it's about race or gender or sexuality or what, this a lecturer transgresses that, and so they're shut down. And now that guy's been taken out. And he said, he goes, I was talking to my dad about it. He grew up in communist Yugoslavia, and he goes, you know what this sounds like? He said, what? Communism. And that, what we're seeing, what you're seeing, I think, is the death of Western liberal democratic. You know, the thing that created these art forms that we really value, that is dying because we're moving to a different culture.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, and I don't want to get off topic, but it's like I'm not a big fan of Noam Chomsky because he's a genocide denier in terms of communism, and it's like, how can you be open-minded and liberal? And
I've talked for so long. I've got to do an interview on the radio now.
Okay. All right.
Well, you want to stop it there?
Yeah, and I'll link to your website.
I'm gonna have to jump out really quick. Sorry about this.
No problem.